Can the coronavirus curve be flattened? Some countries say their fast responses managed to slow the pandemic, but the disease is still spreading. So, what will it take to control it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. Now, the number of people infected by COVID-19 is more than 1 million globally. The number who've died is almost 60,000. The United States currently has the highest number of infections. Italy, the biggest number of deaths. Yet some countries appear to be succeeding at flattening the curve. The number of new cases each day appears to be falling in nations such as Taiwan, Canada, South Korea and Iceland. They've all shown that the rate of infections can be slowed down. The US, which has been criticised for a slow and ineffective response, seems to have now become the main centre of the pandemic. But the US President Donald Trump says he has just the man to help tackle the crisis. His senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is leading the coronavirus task force. So how have some countries managed to control the rate of infections and deaths? And can others, Italy and Spain, bring theirs down too? OK, let's get going. Let's bring in our guests today. In Piacenza, in Italy, we have GLORIA TALIANI. She's an infectious disease doctor and member of the COVID-19 task force of the Italian Civil Protection System. In Singapore, we have THOMPSON. He's a senior research fellow at the National University of Singapore and formerly a US Department of Defense official. And from London, we have Dr. Annie SPARROW. She's an emergency and critical care physician. Welcome to you all. GLORIA TALIANI, coming to you first. Which countries are flattening the curve more than other countries, and how are they doing it?
Probably the best one has been Korea, and followed by China. And probably the best way to flat down the curve is to force people to stay home in the most serious, most convincing, most persuading way, because people contacts between people, between uninfected and healthy carrier people, is the way the virus uses to spread all over the countries, all over the geographic realities. Therefore, this is the best and probably at the moment the unique way to control the spreading of the virus.
Drew Thompson in Singapore, it seems that there are huge variations country to country, region to region. Does it come down to the initial infection rate, that spike that we've seen on the graph for so many different countries, or how governments respond to that?
Well, certainly it's how Dr. TALIANI referred to the social distancing or separating of people is probably the most important factor in how governments encourage their populations to stay home and practice social distancing, as well as identifying and isolating high-risk individuals, I think is critical. And here in Singapore, of course, that we've just announced that will go for a month long, they're calling it a circuit breaker. Other countries might call it a lockdown, but essentially it's an extreme form of social distancing. So we're no longer leaving the house. Schools, work is all being done by remote. So I think that's going to be critical. And in a country like Singapore, you can do that very effectively. It's much more difficult, say, in the United States, where individual freedoms are much more important and the government has much less authority to prevent people from leaving their homes. Much more difficult to enforce that in the US. So yeah, we're going to see wide variation between the capacity of different states to enforce that social distancing.
Annie SPARROW in London, how long until Britain is in a position to say, yes, we are flattening the curve?
Well, that is hard to say. I mean, in most countries we've seen this take, but those have done it so far, it seems to take sort of 8 to 10 to 12 weeks. But when you think about it globally, it's a bit like we're seeing this ring of volcanoes erupt. And then, that eruption can build up over a series of weeks. And then we finally can see it flatten, as we're just now beginning to see perhaps in Italy. And the UK is still very much on the upward of that. And I think that it's going to be another few weeks, that, the next 2 weeks are going to be pretty bad. And then after that, we may see it leveling off. It's very hard to say exactly. We may need to do what Singapore is doing also in terms of circuit breaking.
Drew Thompson in Singapore, staying with that idea of circuit breaking, is there another variable? Because I think everyone would be agreed if they said, if they said Singapore has done a very good job. But there is another variable here, and it's honesty, isn't it? Because people are now asking questions about the truth of what may or may not have happened in China.
Well, certainly in China, the political overlay on everything, including public health, has resulted in statistics being manipulated to suit political objectives. Here in Singapore, obviously, it's quite different. The Singapore government has taken a very comprehensive approach to the epidemic by certainly by being transparent and by producing a fair amount of information about each case and how that each case is linked to the other. They've also done extensive contact tracing, not just by health authorities, but by the police. And they've done a lot of very, very effective, very clear, concise public messaging from the Prime Minister on down. So, I mean, we're very fortunate to have excellent governance here. But it's that really all of government approach that I think has served Singapore quite well. But I mean, it's also worth noting that Singapore went from 100 cases to 1,000 cases in a month, even with all of these undertakings. So I think it's an extreme challenge, and that's partly because of the difficulties of capturing cases when they're asymptomatic and still potentially spreading. So everyone in Singapore is supposed to be taking your temperature before you enter a building. I take my temperature twice a day and submit it to a database. So the monitoring is extensive, but it's very difficult to track those asymptomatic spreaders. And that's where the circuit breaking and the social distancing becomes such a critical option.
Gloria Taliani there in Piacenza in Italy. Are the authorities there where you are in a position yet to start doing what Drew was talking about to flatten the curve, i.e. check people's temperatures twice a day if they decide that's the best way forward? Because this is not about the rate of infection. This is about moderating the flow of infected people going through the healthcare system, so the healthcare system doesn't get even more stressed compared to where it is as of now.
I don't believe that controlling the temperature twice a day will help much to control the number of infected people, because now that we perform the antibodies testing to many people, we really have the evidence that the majority of those who result positive were totally asymptomatic. And it's absolutely true, mainly for young children or young adults, but also for some adults who still maintain a totally healthy condition, but they have been infected. Therefore, the most important measure should be, again, to reinforce the political teaching of all people to wash their hands, to take care of avoiding spreading the infection by wearing masks, social distance, which is much more physical distance than social one, and stay home for the most of the time.
Annie Sparrow in London, staying with that crucial idea of antibody testing, that's not the same as coming up with a vaccine or vaccine testing. Correct me if I've got this right or wrong. Antibody testing means you test someone, and if it comes back positive or negative, that means they have got immunity for whatever reason, or they have not. Therefore, that person is safe, so they can encounter the virus again and they won't succumb to it again.
That's certainly what we think. However, there are two important antibodies that need to be discerned. The first antibody, IgM, can appear within a week, 5 to 6 days of being infected. And that goes up and then subsides. It's the appearance of IgG antibody, IgG, that is indicative of immunity. And that tends to appear about 4 or 5 6 weeks even after you've had the infection. And that's what we use to indicate immunity. And that's what is leading to this whole sort of conversation and chatter about immunity passports and immunity certificates, even as evidence that you have had the infection and that you are immune. They're not 100%. In other diseases, we do see that not everybody actually mounts an antibody response. That can depend on other factors, but it is a marker of immunity. And you're right, it's not the same as a vaccine.
Drew Thompson in Singapore, we're also having to talk, I guess, as well about some of the modelling that's out there, some of the modelling that is good and accurate and some of it that is not. Because when it comes to this idea of herd immunity, flattening the curve perhaps, there's a thing called an R0 number, a Rort number, and say if your Rort number is 10, if my Rort number was 10, that means I could infect 10 people, the first 10 people that I met. So in a perfect world, from a statistical point of view, you want to get that number less than 1, i.e. statistically, I would infect less than 1 person every 24 hours. How do different governments around the globe deal with that part of what they're trying to do?
So, I mean, I will defer to the medical experts and the statistics experts and the epidemiologists on transmissibility and the R0 figures. But again, I think it really comes down to the political choices that leaders around the world have to make about enabling their economies to continue to putter along as best they can under the circumstances, which means allowing a certain amount of commerce to continue, a certain number of people to continue to provide essential services, manufacturing, transportation, of course, healthcare, food. These are critical services that need to continue, but also other key business activities that sustain an economy, and that could be energy production as well, or auto repair or manufacturing. So in that respect, it's really a political decision about whether you value the health risk of transmission between one person and multiple others, or whether you emphasize keeping them at home. Obviously, for some folks, there are opportunities to increase your social distancing but still be productive. So I, for one, haven't left my house in a week, and I have been doing all of my work over just like this, over Skype and Zoom and WeChat and WhatsApp. So that I can continue to do my work. All of my classes that I teach with all of my students now are online. So that's one way that we can still continue to function, but at the same time reduce the transmission. And again, each country is going to have their own formula for that.
Gloria Taliani in Italy, are we also having to accept another reality when it comes to getting this curve, not as spiky, getting it flattened out? We have to deal with variables which present themselves as accepting a trend based on trends, plural, because Johns Hopkins, their wonderful device, their tracker today, making the point that the US, Spain, Germany and Italy are reporting each 2,000 new cases per day. That's an astonishing figure, and it's difficult to see how quickly that will go from being a spike or even a second spike to that curve flattening out.
Well, if we look at the influenza pandemic of 1918, we can imagine that many bursts of infection will reappear after the first one. Nevertheless, now we are much more prepared to control the occurrence of an epidemic even in small areas and in larger areas. What is important to remember is that we don't really know how many persons are infected by anyone who is tested and recognized. Therefore, we really don't know how many persons are immune. And first of all, testing immunity of as many people as possible would be helpful to understand this figure. Secondly, in some region of the North Italy, the governors are thinking of testing people and gradually allowing them to restart working if they are demonstrated to be immune, which is an intelligent political decision, because it allows to restart the economic flow of the country, of the region, and without putting anyone in danger.
Annie Sparrow in London, the CDC today on its website saying that they learnt lessons from the H1N1 pandemic back in 2009. Their lessons basically boil down to social distancing or social isolation. So when the weather is good in Europe, as it is this weekend right now, and people are going to the parks, people are cycling, people are taking the dogs for the walk, they're having a barbecue on the River Thames, what goes through your mind at that point?
I confess it is disturbing, and I've been out today too watching all of that, and it's concerning because it's easy to get lax and to think it's okay, it's coming down, it's not affecting me, the weather's beautiful, and we know that there's always a seasonal drop in these type of infections. But we can't get complacent. I mean, as you just pointed out, there's a huge increase every day in Europe. Italy is the epicenter, but Spain and UK and France, we are all seeing this massive increase in effect of America is a disaster, of course, and it's only going to get worse there as well. So this is where we are. We are now considering measures like masks. The CDC has just brought out new guidance to consider that we should have community mask wearing, and that can be very useful if you consider that most of the spread is, of course, we think to the best of our knowledge, is still done by people who are symptomatic and are coughing and sneezing, and therefore, if you put a mask on those people, then you stop the source. If those who are uninfected wear masks or bandanas or homemade, scarves and so forth, what that does is it actually stops to a large extent you touching your nose and your mouth all the time. There's a physical barrier, and that probably goes, quite a long way when you put those two pieces together towards, reducing transmission. And, we need to sort of add all the measures that we can think of. The social distancing, the circuit breaking, the use of masks, the use of other measures like I've talked about before, like the BCG vaccine as a pandemic protector, as a partial protector, to be able to reduce the severity of infections and to kind of stagger the, the curve.
Okay. Drew Thompson in Singapore, on that idea of staggering the curve, people like you, I think I'm right in saying this, you call it risk stratification. Somebody someplace has to decide when you've got a big enough percentage of the population who are immune or they've had the vaccine, therefore they're immune. When do you allow them to go back to work? At what point does that flattened curve globally say, yes, certain people can go back to work because the economic impact is so huge, we can stop, say, a global recession tipping into being a global depression?
So again, it'll be different for different countries, and I think that's really important to remember. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for a country, again, like Singapore, which is highly dependent on foreign trade and international trade. One of the indicators to watch for is when flights begin to resume and people are permitted to travel, or perhaps travel without having to undergo a quarantine when they arrive somewhere. So those will be indications that the curve is sufficiently flattened. What that means in terms of the numbers of cases or individuals being infected, that's going to be different in different places. In a large country like China or the United States, that number might be larger on a per capita, but the question is on a per capita basis, what does it mean? Also, localities will matter. So I think some countries are going to be under much more pressure to open up to foreign travel sooner, like Singapore. China in particular will want to start opening up as well because their economy is highly dependent on trade as well. So other countries may be less so motivated and will seek to protect their population from external or what they call imported cases. So again, there's no good answer, and I think each country will have to make its own choice, and that's the burden on our political leaders.
Gloria, this is clearly something we're involved in for the long haul, if you will. How do you flatten the curve for more than 2 weeks? How do you flatten it for 3 months or 6 months, say?
Well, since the problem is always the same, we don't know who is carrying the virus in their throat or nose or mouth, and they are asymptomatic. Probably the best would be to stop, to convince people to wear masks for longer than we are now thinking about. And now we are figuring that in a few weeks we can restart our life in the way we were used to do. But probably this is not the case. And so if we all wear a mask, apart from those who are definitely recognized as immune, all the other people, if they don't have a clear evidence of their immunity, if all other people wear masks, and in the case of masks to be worn, it's simply the mask who is needed is the surgical one. There's no need for more filtering ones, because if all wear masks, anyone is protected from the other, because I cannot spread the virus and no one can spread the virus.
Okay, so the most basic mask, I guess what we're saying is the most basic mask becomes a symbol, it becomes emblematic of social responsibility. We're heading towards the end of the programme. Annie Sparrow in London. So technically, politically, socially, this is very difficult to achieve because we all want to get to that flattened curve. Out of those three things, the technicalities, the politics and the social distancing, for presidents and prime ministers, which one is the easiest to achieve?
Well, the social distancing is the easiest and in many ways the safest. To that, I think you certainly can add in masks very easily and sort of much easier than the question of immunity, which lends itself to all sorts of concerns. Once we bring in immunity, then you start to use that as a it lends itself to corruption, bribery, exploitation. Who gets tested? In Italy, the government tested everybody, and that was fantastic in certain areas. But then you can see how it can then become, as a passport back to work, well, that's problematic in many ways, because there are a lot of people who may not be able to afford testing, may not be able to reach it, etc. Meanwhile, I think we have to be on the, as you pointed out, that we're only as good as the numbers that we have. And at the moment, China is in an advanced stage of the epidemic and the rest of us are playing catch up. There will be, treatments available that China is going to be bringing out very shortly. And in September, when our winter season begins to start again with flu season, they'll be the ones with the vaccines to provide. So I think, in the longer term, there are a lot of things that might also lend themselves to stopping the curve. But they're going to be coming out of China first. So.
Okay. Very briefly, last word to you, Drew Thompson in Singapore. Keep it brief, please. We've got 20 seconds left. What we're talking about here is coherent, unified leadership. Is there one leader around the world for you who's doing that?
Clearly, one of the casualties of COVID has been global leadership. There has not been any one leader rising to the fore, neither Xi Jinping nor President Trump, certainly not the WHO or the United Nations system. So this is really a new era of anti-globalization, if you will, where each country is on its own.
It all comes down to that social distancing, social isolation. Thank you all very much. It's been a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you to our guests. They were Gloria Taliani, Drew Thompson and Dr. Annie Sparrow. And thank you, too, for your company. You can see the show again via the website, aljazeera.com. Or for more discussion, do check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can keep the conversation going on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. You can tweet me. I'm at Peter Dobby1 from me, Peter Dobby, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We will do it all again at the usual times tomorrow. Bye-bye.